Greetings everyone, I am Syed Alizia Jafri and I welcome you to this CNS Miss webinar entitled Understanding the Emotional Dynamics of Nuclear Crises. 6 years to the day, India became the first nuclear armed state to launch an air attack on its nuclear armed adversary. Pakistan's then Premier Imran Khan sanctioned a measured yet resolute response to India's infringement of sovereignty, with a view to re establishing red lines and showing resolve. Appearing on national TV after Pakistan took retaliatory action, Khan said all major wars, not least the two world wars, were rife with and a product of miscalculations, and that the kinds of weapons both India and Pakistan have do not leave room for any of those. While he rightly spoke to the increasing likelihood and dangers of miscalculating both intent and action, scholars like Reid Polly and Ross McDermott contend that leaders retain agency and take escalatory risky actions due to a host of emotional and psychological factors. But do heightened emotions always engender escalation, or could they also help de escalate crises? At a time when nuclear risks are increasing and crisis management is becoming more complicated, this question is important to academicians and policymakers alike. To delve into all this, I'm fortunate to be joined by Dr. Nicholas J. Wheeler, who is a professor of international relations in the Department of Political Science and International Studies at the University of Birmingham. He's a non resident senior fellow with the British American Security Information Council and has been part of its program on nuclear responsibilities since its inception in 2017. His publications include Trusting Enemies, Interpersonal Relationships in International Conflict with Ken Booth, The Security Dilemma, Fear, Cooperation, and Trust in World Politics, and Saving Strangers, Humanitarian Intervention in International Society. He's co editor with Professor Christian Roest Smith and Elvin Go of the Cambridge Series in International Relations, associate editor of the Journal of Trust Research, and a fellow of the Academy of Social Sciences. He was appointed as the first director of the Institute for Conflict, Cooperation and Security at the University of Birmingham in February 2012. I'm also delighted that Dr. Jeffrey Knopf will act as a discussant for today. He's professor and chair, Nonproliferation and Terrorism Studies program here at MIS. He's also a research affiliate with CNS and Stanford University's Center on International Security and Cooperation. Dr. Knopf received a PhD in political science from Stanford University. Prior to joining MIS, he taught at the Naval Postgraduate School, the University of California, Santa Cruz, and the University of Southern California. Dr. Knopf is a former editor of the Non-Proliferation Review and has published research on nuclear arms control, non-proliferation, deterrence strategy, and how public opinion, NGOs, and social movements affect national security policies. Thank you so much, Dr. Nick and Dr. Knopf, for gracing this program, which I believe is being done at a very, very timely, unfortunately, I'm saying this, a very timely global milieu, which is rife with risks, uncertainties, and um, threats. Um, so, Nick, I would like to start off the proceedings by asking you to delve into this intricate yet understudied topic for around 35 to 40 minutes, and then we'll proceed further. Thank you so much, and over to you.
Thanks, Ali. And first of all, thank you very much for that warm and generous introduction, and indeed for inviting me to speak today, and to Jeff for agreeing to act as discussant. It's great to see some old friends here, and it's a great pleasure to be talking at this CNS MIIS webinar. I've never actually made it out there in person. That's not a hint, but I do hope at some point one day that I'll get that opportunity. Right. So let me share my screen if I can. And hopefully this is the right one. And are we good to go? So what I want to talk on today is a topic that I was just mentioning briefly there in relation to the work that we do on South Asia that I do with BASIC, that Ali mentioned in his introduction. And this idea of emotional dynamics of nuclear crises develops out of a chapter that I wrote with my very good friend and colleague and co-author, Marcus Holmes, at the College of William and Mary. And we have a chapter forthcoming in the Oxford Handbook of the Emotions, which is on this topic, and which I'm going to use as the basis for my talk tonight in large measure. I'd also make a plug that Marcus and I are about to submit, I think probably no more than 2 or 3 weeks now, our new book, of which this is part of the work that we've been doing for several years now, in developing a theory of social bond formation and the idea of how trust can develop through social bonding. I'm going to say something about that. And our new book has, I think, an intriguing title. It's provisionally entitled Atomic Bonds, Interpersonal Diplomacy in International Crises. And as you'll see as I go through it in the next half an hour or so, the interpersonal is an important part of how we want to think about this question of emotional dynamics of nuclear crises. Okay, so what I'm going to do is I'm going to talk about essentially a conventional wisdom which highlights the role of emotions in nuclear crises, which sees them as generating escalation and as being a fundamental problem. What we want to argue is that actually emotions might not always lead to escalation in the nuclear crisis. And it might actually be the case that the context of a nuclear crisis is one in which emotional dynamics can develop that actually promote de-escalation. And here, the key concept that we want to leverage is the idea of what I first called with Ken Booth in the book that we wrote in 2008 on the security dilemma sensibility. And I'm going to say a lot more about that in a moment. And then we argue that the Cuban Missile Crisis provides a really interesting illustration of how the emotional dynamics in a nuclear crisis can actually generate empathy and even trust. And security dilemma sensibility is a particular form of empathy, SDS. And so the core of the argument is that the emotion of fear can actually lead to a positive outcome, rather than the usual assumption that this heightened emotion of fear in a crisis leads to distrust, suspicion, and increased escalation risks. So I'm going to divide my talk into 3 parts. First, I'm going to discuss the theory and the empirical indicators we derive from it for the idea that empathy and trust can develop in a nuclear crisis, the emotional dynamics that we want to focus on. Then I'll briefly turn to the case study, and then finally conclude with some of the theoretical implications that flow from the research. In the chapter, which will be out in a few months' time, we also discuss policy-related implications, but I think time's going to preclude getting into those, but very happy to pick them up in Q&A. So let me start then, and Ali mentioned Reid Pawley and Rose McDermott's excellent 2021 article in International Security. But I think it's a really powerful statement that they make here. they say it is indeed irrational to carry out a nuclear threat if massive nuclear retaliation is expected. But a human decision maker acting on emotion or psychological bias might do so anyway. So that's a really powerful statement about how human decision makers in a crisis could find themselves through emotions taking what they would want to call an irrational decision. So, and this argument isn't just an outlier. If you go back to K.J. Holster's classic book, Crisis, Escalation and War in the early 1970s, and you mentioned, Jeff, earlier about Alexander George, of course. I mean, that whole research and work that was going on in the 60s was very much highlighting emotions as being a fundamental problem, that it was a threat to rationality in a crisis. So, and then I've got the example here of Robin Mark Wicker's book from 2018 on emotional choices, focusing, one of his case studies is on Cuba, the other one's on Saddam's invasion of Kuwait in August 1990. And Mark Wicker highlights, in the Cuban case in particular, the negative effects of anger and humiliation, and how this was really important in leading Khrushchev to place the missiles in Cuba. And again, we have this argument about emotions driving actors into behaviors that can be escalatory and dangerous. And then the third one I have there is from James Johnson, who's doing a lot of very interesting work on AI and nuclear decision making. And in his 23 book on AI and the bomb, he highlights there the way in which emotions can lead actors into taking actions where they're more likely to engage in escalatory behavior. So what we wanted to do was take issue with this broad conventional wisdom and explore the possibility that actually what might happen in the crisis is that emotional dynamics could develop between leaders and top-level decision makers that would actually lead people to find common ground and the possibility of de-escalation. And we got there essentially through looking at the Cuban Missile Crisis, and we wrote an article in the European Journal of International Relations in 2021 called "The Strength of Weak Bonds." And what we wanted to, and what we showed in that article was that a bond developed between Kennedy and Khrushchev during the Cuban Missile Crisis that actually led to the development of empathy, and we would argue trust. And this started to suggest to us that perhaps we could then build a theory for the conditions under which these positive emotional dynamics might develop in a crisis, rather than the negative escalatory dynamics that the conventional wisdom had focused on. And as I say, the key concept here was this idea of security dilemma sensibility. So let me just delve into security dilemma sensibility a little bit. So Ken Booth and I defined it in 2008 as an actor's intention and capacity to perceive the motives behind and to show responsiveness towards the potential complexity of the military intentions of others. In particular, it refers to the ability to understand the role that fear might play in their attitudes and behavior, including, crucially, the role that one's own actions may play in provoking that fear. Now, security dilemma sensibility, this particular form of empathy that we're interested in, is the opposite of what Booth and I, in the same book, called a peaceful defensive self-image. And here we were building on security dilemma theory, standing on the shoulders of giants like Robert Jervis. And the security dilemma literature has highlighted this problem that actors fail to see, that others don't see them as they see themselves. This fundamental inability to recognize that your own actions might be seen as threatening because you think that those others know that you don't mean them any harm. You believe that they know that you're defensive, but of course they don't have those assurances. And this is the fundamental problem of the security dilemma. And I think you can see it really well encapsulated here. This of course is Caspar Weinberger, US Defense Secretary in the early 1980s in the Reagan administration. And then on the right, we have Yuri Andropov, the Soviet General Secretary and leader of the Soviet Union at the time. And it's in the context of the SDI that Reagan was very keen to develop a space-based defense for the United States against Soviet nuclear missiles. And Weinberger made this really quite striking statement. But if I persuade you that this is a really important way of thinking about international relations, you'll start to see examples of this all the time around you. So Weinberger said that the Soviets know perfectly well that we will never launch a first strike on the Soviet Union. They know perfectly well that we will never launch a first strike on the Soviet Union. But of course, Weinberger just couldn't enter into the fear that the Soviets had of the United States at the time. And Soviet decision makers had no such assurances. And so, not surprisingly, they responded with countervailing responses. But of course, because Weinberger believed that the Soviets knew that America didn't have any hostile intentions towards the Soviet Union, American decision makers interpreted those Soviet countervailing responses as evidence of Soviet hostile intent. And so setting in motion a really powerful cycle of security competition between the two sides, leading to, in November 1983, the Able-Archer nuclear crisis, when there's quite a bit of evidence that Soviet decision makers and top military officials thought that a NATO command post nuclear exercise in Europe, Able-Archer, might be a countdown for a nuclear strike on the Soviet Union. We could talk more about that in Q&A if people want to explore it further. So I think it was never better put than by Herbert Butterfield in 1951 in his wonderful book, History and Human Relations, in the opening chapter called The Tragic Element of International Conflict. And Butterfield said, "It is the peculiar characteristic of the situation I am describing, the situation of what I should call Hobbesian fear, that you yourself may vividly feel the terrible fear that you have of the other party, but you cannot enter into the other man's counter fear or even understand why he should be particularly nervous. For you know that you yourself mean him no harm, and that you want nothing from him save guarantees for your own safety. And it is never possible for you to realize or remember properly that since he cannot see the inside of your mind, he can never have the same assurance of your intentions that you have." So security dilemma sensibility is the fundamental corrective to what Butterfield is describing here. It's the capacity to enter into the other person's counter fear, to understand why they might feel nervous, and indeed to look for ways to reassure them. And what Marcus Holmes and I argue is that the development of security dilemma sensibility in a nuclear crisis is a very important mechanism that needs to come into play if we want that crisis to end peacefully. Now, despite Butterfield's challenge, we argue we argued in 2018, Marcus and I, in two separate books, his on face-to-face diplomacy, neuroscience and international relations, mine trusting enemies. We argued in both those books that actually Reagan and Gorbachev, only 2 years after the Abu Archer nuclear crisis, Reagan and Gorbachev met in Geneva in November 1985 and began to chart the path of the superpowers out of the Cold War. So one of the really interesting things about Butterfield is that he didn't believe that decision makers contemporaneously could ever achieve this, putting themselves in the shoes of the other. But actually what Reagan and Gorbachev showed was that this was possible, and in important ways that opened up the pathway to trust. So I just want to move the discussion on to talk about trust very quickly. So I define trust as an expectation of no harm in a context where betrayal is always possible. Trust can only ever exist in conditions of uncertainty and indeed vulnerability. For trust to develop at the highest levels of diplomacy, I argued in my 2018 book, Trusting Enemies, that security dilemma sensibility has to be present on both sides. And this links, Jeff, to something I was reading this afternoon in your chapter about the importance of nuclear learning. It's really important that it's shared between the two sides. You've got to have the same understanding of nuclear weapons or you're going to get into trouble. Well, for trust to develop between leaders of adversarial states, they both need to share security dilemma sensibility. They have to come to a recognition that the other party is capable of exercising it towards them, and that they come to realize that they have to exercise it towards the other party, but then they need to test that out. And this is where I think face-to-face diplomacy and other modalities of interpersonal interaction are so important in testing out an intuition or a belief of security dilemma sensibility. So if two leaders find themselves in a situation where they share security dilemma sensibility, that both sides know that, then the door is open to the development of trust. And what I argued in my 2018 book, and what we develop at length in the new book, is that this develops through a process of social bonding. And the two key components of the bonding process are that there's a positive identification of interests. So there has to be a shared commitment to security. I have to place the same value on your security that you place on mine. That doesn't mean that there necessarily has to be shared positions, because Reagan and Gorbachev disagreed all the way through their tenure in office over the Strategic Defense Initiative. But I would argue that they developed a shared commitment to each other's security. And then secondly, and crucially, there has to be humanization. There has to be this identification with the humanity of the other. What Gorbachev called after his first meeting with Reagan when he walked back to the mission, the human factor. And then this is them on the slide. This is them at Reykjavik in October 1986, where, of course, they came tantalizingly close to abolishing US and Soviet nuclear weapons. So with that sort of theoretical ground clearing kind of out of the way, how then might security dilemma sensibility emerge in a nuclear crisis? Well, what we argue in the chapter and in the book is that the intense emotion of fear that's produced in a nuclear crisis gives rise to two traits. Now, some people might want to call these emotions, but we prefer the language of traits. And the two traits that we want to talk about are urgency and a sense of shared vulnerability. And we argued that it's the emotion of fear and these traits that can lead to the emergence of security dilemma sensibility and even trust. Let me say a little bit about urgency and shared vulnerability. Driving urgency means that decision makers are forced to make decisions in compressed timeframes indeed, which could become even more compressed in an AI future. But far from this leading to escalatory decision making, we argue that leaders may be more willing to empathize with their adversaries' fears, so to exercise that security dilemma sensibility, recognizing that the urgency they feel is mutual. So far from this leading to hasty decision making as the conventional wisdom would have it, urgency can propel leaders into transcending their own cognitive and emotional biases, so better understanding their adversaries. So while urgency undoubtedly poses undeniable risks, we argue that its pressure cooker environment can also distill complexities, sharpen focus, and encourage the development of security dilemma sensibility. What about shared vulnerability? When parties recognize their mutual vulnerability, it can facilitate a shift from confrontational to cooperative attitudes. And we argue that this can lead to the triggering of security dilemma sensibility as leaders become more capable of understanding and appreciating the complex intentions and fears of the other party. Vulnerability can be a pivot point, transforming a confrontational dynamic into one that offers a window of opportunity for de-escalation and constructive engagement. In essence, the sense of mutual vulnerability can serve as a potent catalyst for the development of security dilemma sensibility, as it triggers a profound understanding of shared stakes and risks. In sum, we argue that when both sides recognize that they share the same fundamental fears, the fear of destruction, the fear for their people's safety, and the fear of an irreversible mistake, it creates a basis for mutual understanding. Put another way, the shared sense of existential dread can paradoxically serve as a platform for shared understanding. In these high-stakes moments, the development of security dilemma sensibility becomes not just an intellectual exercise, but a survival imperative. Leaders, cognizant of the fragile balance between peace and devastation, may find themselves more open to diplomatic channels and less likely to engage in brinkmanship. And then to develop this further, we identified 4 empirical indicators that we could look for to see whether these emotional dynamics, these positive emotional dynamics, are present in crisis situations. So first, and once you're in the crisis, fear should manifest itself in diplomatic communications that express existential concerns. Now, these might include statements recognizing the high stakes involved for both national and global security. Secondly, we would expect to see discrete overtures aimed at de-escalation, as leaders realize the dire consequences of miscalculation. Fear, acting as a catalyst, not only accelerates the sense of urgency, but also heightens the awareness of shared vulnerability, as I've said. And as a result, and thirdly, this should be empirically observable in diplomatic interactions, where there will be an increased acknowledgement of mutual susceptibility to the perilous consequences of the crisis. Here, leaders can be expected to express a deepened understanding of the immediate and severe risks, both to their own nations and to global security, thereby illustrating the intertwined nature of fear, urgency, and shared vulnerability in the crucible of a nuclear standoff. And fourthly, we would expect on this matter of vulnerability that leaders might make explicit or implicit admissions about the high stakes involved, recognizing in their communication that both sides share a common vulnerability. This suggests that the acceleration of diplomatic communication is a relevant factor, but what's critical is the quality or character of the communication. That character or quality of communication will have crucially changed to emphasize how the shared vulnerability to nuclear destruction is generating a shared responsibility for de-escalating the crisis. So that's the theory. These are the empirical indicators. What about the case study? So the Cuban Missile Crisis is almost universally acknowledged, I think, as the most dangerous crisis to date of the nuclear age. The closest the world has ever come to a full-scale nuclear war. And we argue, in line with our theoretical framework, that these emotional dynamics that I've talked about were intricately woven into the fabric of the crisis. Fear, of course, was palpable on both sides. Kennedy and the ex-com grappling with the existential threat posed to American cities by the 48 medium-range ballistic missiles that were rapidly becoming operational on the island of Cuba. US decision makers believed that they were operating with a closing decision window in which the weapons could be ready within a matter of days. While Khrushchev, of course, faced the prospect of a US and Western counterstrike that could devastate the Soviet Union. This fear, paradoxically though, induced a greater frequency and urgency in their communications. Both leaders understood that they were operating on a very tight timeline, with every moment lost heightening the risk of an irrevocable decision being made. We argue, and we developed this first in the European Journal of International Relations article I mentioned, that the written correspondence, Kennedy and Khrushchev had no phone calls during the crisis and no face-to-face interaction, but they did have an extensive written correspondence. We argue that this written correspondence and the letters make fascinating reading, offer a compelling window into the development and manifestation of security dilemma sensibility. Our analysis underscores how the written word became a crucial medium through which leaders communicated their fear, urgency, and vulnerability. This textual diplomatic interaction was instrumental in fostering a mutual understanding that is essential for developing security dilemma sensibility. This unique mode of emotional exchange through written communication in the nuclear crisis underscores the complexity of the crisis and goes beyond an interpretation of the crisis in terms of individual decisions as isolated emotional responses. So much of the literature, the conventional wisdom, focuses on individual decisions in terms of emotional responses. What we've highlighted in our work is this interpersonal dimension, this social interactive element, drawing on constructivist IR theory and social interactionism, highlighting instead a nuanced dance of mutual understanding and empathy, and indeed trust, conducted through carefully crafted diplomatic texts. Khrushchev's letter of 26th of October, and I noticed, Jeff, that you have that in the chapter that you kindly shared with me, in the argument you make about this fascinating argument about the relationship between fear and hope and the way that we need to bring them together. Khrushchev's letter of the 26th of October, which if you haven't read, I would strongly encourage you to look at, encapsulated the sense of shared vulnerability between the two leaders and the necessity for them to respond to each other with the exercise of security dilemma sensibility and even trust. And the slide there of Kennedy and Khrushchev, of course, that's from the Vienna summit in June 1961. And the reason why I wanted to put it there is because as a result of that summit where they did meet face to face, the two leaders entered the Cuban Missile Crisis in a state of deep distrust. So it's all the more remarkable. So they had a disastrous summit in Vienna. They couldn't agree on the situation over Berlin. They entered the Cuban Missile Crisis in October 1962 in a deep relationship of distrust. And yet we argue that because of these emotional dynamics, they were able to navigate that relationship into one of weak trust. Not strong trust, but enough trust to enable them to manage a peaceful de-escalation of the crisis. Khrushchev wrote to Kennedy in that letter, quote, "You and I should not now pull on the ends of the rope in which you have tied a knot of war, because the harder you and I pull, the tighter the knot will become. And a time may come when this knot is tied so tight that the person who tied it is no longer capable of untying it," end quote. This metaphor not only encapsulated the urgency and the high stakes, but also projected a sense of shared vulnerability and the responsibility this imposed on both leaders to steer their countries away from nuclear conflict. Khrushchev offered Kennedy an off-ramp in that letter by promising to remove the Soviet missiles in return for a US commitment not to invade Cuba. Kennedy's acceptance of Khrushchev's terms the following day brought to an end the fear and urgency that both leaders had experienced, effectively untying the knot that Khrushchev had referred to. By expressing their shared vulnerabilities through these letters and eschewing nuclear brinkmanship strategies, Kennedy and Khrushchev created an environment where both security dilemma sensibility and trust could emerge, allowing for a resolution to what is to date, as I say, the most dangerous confrontation in human history. So what then are the theoretical implications by way of conclusion? Well, we argue in the chapter that the Cuban Missile Crisis stands as a striking example of how security dilemma sensibility and trust can emerge even in the most pressured and dire circumstances. Heightened emotions in the form of fear, driving urgency and vulnerability acted as catalysts, forcing both leaders into a space where they had to confront their own and each other's vulnerabilities. Now, they could have responded to these shared vulnerabilities by seeking to manipulate the other's fear to secure a unilateral advantage in the crisis. But crucially, Kennedy and Khrushchev responded to the emotional intensity by recognizing that competitive manipulations of risk could only lead to mutual disaster. Now, a lot of the existing literature, Jim Blight's wonderful book, A Shattered Crystal Ball, and Mark Wicker's book from 2018, highlight these individual emotional responses. And this is obviously an important part of the story. But what I hope I've tried to persuade you of is that we also need to study the shared emotional context, the shared interpersonal dynamics. Because in the case of the Cuban Missile Crisis, it was these that was instrumental in transforming perceptions and leading to a more empathetic approach towards the adversary on both sides. It encouraged leaders to consider not just their own security concerns, but also those of their opponents, fostering a deeper understanding that is vital for the development of SDS. But the theoretical puzzle that we begin to open up, but do not delve into in the chapter, though we do a little bit more in the book, and I want to do more on this in future work, is what explains why security dilemma sensibility and trust comes into operation in some crises and not in others. So I've argued that security dilemma sensibility was really important in de-escalating the Cuban Missile Crisis. But it was much more muted, if not non-existent, in the Berlin crisis of October 1961, when Soviet and American tanks faced one another 200 or so yards apart at Checkpoint Charlie. And of course, the slide I have here, coming back to where Ali started us this evening, started the talk, is of course the slide of the two leaders who were in a nuclear crisis 6 years ago today. And I've emphasized how important communication was between Kennedy and Khrushchev. But what's really interesting is that there was no leader-to-leader communication between Modi and Imran Khan during the Balakot crisis. And indeed, tomorrow, 6 years ago, the Pakistani High Commissioner reached out to his Indian counterpart to say that Imran Khan would like to talk to Modi. And this was the high point of the crisis. An Indian plane had been shot down, an Indian pilot was in Pakistani custody. It's claimed that there was degrees of nuclear alerting. And yet the word came back to the Pakistani High Commissioner that Prime Minister Modi was not available at this hour. Now, just imagine if during the Cuban Missile Crisis, Kennedy and Khrushchev had not been able to communicate. So what I'm left puzzling over in relation to Balakot is why there wasn't more communication that was aimed at reassurance. There was communication in back channels, but it is reported that communication was the conveying of threats. Ali talked about it being the first time a nuclear armed state had used force on the territory of another nuclear armed state. It was also the first time that missile threats were exchanged in a nuclear dyad, according to what has been reported. So it's a fascinating area to try to think about how crisis communications can be developed more in these situations. And we can talk about US-China, where, again, there are some very interesting questions around crisis communications. And the work I do with BASIC, and as Ali mentioned at the beginning, has been designed in part to try to explore the possibilities for developing more robust channels of communication in crises that might promote greater reassurance, greater security dilemma sensibility. And I think Ali's put one of the reports in the chat where we set out a series of recommendations, including a leader-to-leader hotline between India and Pakistan, which, although there's been times in the history of the subcontinent when they've agreed to have a hotline, it's never become institutionalized over time and being available as a long-term thing in the way that it has been the case with the US-Soviet hotline. That, interestingly, after the crisis, Kennedy and Khrushchev realized that those channels of communication was through letters and so on were too rudimentary, were too cumbersome, and that was the basis on which they agreed to develop in June 1963 the US-Soviet hotline. And then the final sort of area I want to leave you to think about is, I talked about the importance of not focusing just on the individual decisions of leaders, the emotional components of individual decisions, but focusing on the emotional dynamics, not just on individual emotional responses. But there is a really interesting question here about the role of individual traits and dispositions. So how far does the development of security dilemma sensibility and trust in a nuclear crisis come down to the individual traits and dispositions of individual leaders? And how far does it come down to nuclear fear creating an environment in which those individual traits and dispositions play out in an interactive context? And can individual traits and dispositions change through the course of the interaction? We pick up these questions in a bigger way, in the sense that we test them out in a range of cases and develop the theory more behind that in the new book. and I'm happy to talk more about that in questions. But hopefully I've given you enough to reflect on and think about, and I look forward to your comments and questions, and I think I'll stop there. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Nick, for a very wide-ranging, provocative, I must say, talk. You've put so much on the table, which needs a lot of unpacking and and we need to decipher that in details. I would now request Dr. Knopf to act as a discussant and share his remarks on your talk and the broader subject. Over to you, Dr. Knopf.
Great. Thank you, Ali. And thank you very much, Nick, for a really fascinating and thought-provoking talk. I'll try to keep this short because I'm sure the other folks on this webinar have all sorts of questions, and I want to leave plenty of time for Q&A. I've been aware of Nick's work for quite some time, but this Nick very kindly provided the slides in advance, and I realized I haven't been tracking your work as closely and carefully as I should, because in looking at the slides, I realized, oh my goodness, we have a huge amount of overlap and complementarity in our interests and our current research agendas. So as my colleague Philip Blake likes to say, give the bottom line up front. I really like this work. I think it's important, it's interesting, it's insightful, it's original, and so you won't hear any criticisms from me. What I'd like to do is maybe take a couple minutes to tell you how I place it in a larger context and why I think it's important, and then maybe a little bit about future research directions and how to maximize the policy implications of the work. So I've been thinking about the fact that, fingers crossed we make it through the next 6 months or so. In August of this year, it's going to be 80 years since atomic bombs were dropped on Hiroshima and Nagasaki. And I think what I would make note of that anniversary is that 80 years into the nuclear age, the urgency of the question, how do we avoid nuclear war, it's just as pressing, it's just as urgent today as it's been through the whole nuclear era. It's still a danger. It's still something that I think we don't have a sufficient grasp of how to navigate. So one framework that we can use to think about that is one that Jonathan Schell proposed many years ago in his book, The Fate of the Earth, where he sort of played with the Bulletin of the Atomic Scientist doomsday clock. And he said, there's different things you could do that would physically move back in time how long it would take to start a nuclear war. So we had complete nuclear disarmament, presumably the knowledge of how to make the bomb would still exist, but it would take some weeks or months for anybody to reconstitute, a program and build a new nuclear arsenal. You couldn't just push the button, right? If we had de-alerting and you took the warheads off the missiles and physically dispersed them, you could make it like it was hours till you could start a nuclear war. Right? We don't live in those worlds, right? We live in a world in which the leading nuclear powers could start nuclear war on very short notice, and which is still possible to get into a crisis that has nuclear overtones and creates increasing levels of stress and danger. Right. So, in those circumstances where you were, literally on the brink, what is it that might prevent a nuclear war from happening? Right. And there's a few answers that have been given, historically in the literature. I think the most common answer is still deterrence, that, it just wouldn't be rational to start a nuclear war. The costs would outweigh the benefits no matter what. And I think probably most of us on this webinar don't put our faith in that there's just way too much research on the impossibility of human beings to live up to rational decision-making models, the various organizational pathologies that can happen in complex, military organizations, et cetera. Another answer that's been put out there is the so-called nuclear taboo, that in the end we would respect a norm, that this is just unthinkable and taboo. The nuclear taboo idea has taken some pretty massive hits in recent years. There's a lot of research out there that I think casts pretty strong doubt on whether such a thing exists. And in any event, we know that there are actors who are willing to violate norms, right? No norm is absolute. The other answer that's been given, and is probably the one that I would plump down for, is luck. So far, we've just lucked out, right? We've had these crises, and all the things that could go wrong somehow didn't push us over the brink. That's not a very satisfying or encouraging answer, because we can't. Good luck is not something that we can control. It's not something we can count on, right? The next time maybe we have bad luck, right? Not good luck. It's random. We don't know. So most of the existing research, I think, doesn't give us answers that are, to me, very compelling about, at the moment of peak crisis, at the moment when you're most on the brink, how do you avoid going over the brink? And so I think what Nick is doing is he's saying, hey, there's another thing out there, right? There's the interpersonal interactions that are happening in the context of the diplomacy, in the context of the crisis bargaining in the moment, and those individual level leaders and the way they interact with each other, maybe that's doing something that's helping us manage those most dangerous moments of the nuclear age without experiencing the ultimate catastrophe. And I think that's right. I mean, I 100% agree with that, right? And the other thing that Nick is doing is he's saying that in those interpersonal interactions, psychology will enter into this, but it's not just the cognitive dimension of psychology, how we think, how we calculate, how we make decisions. Emotions are going to enter in as well. And I think we now have, 50, 60 years of research that tells us that that's absolutely correct. And in two very different ways, right? So there's hugely influential research that started with the work of Antonio Damasio, which blew up the way many people think about the relationship between reason and emotion, right? We've historically thought that they're opposed to each other, and that the reason we want to be rational is to tame the emotions, to tame the passions, and make rational decisions, right? And through his research, Damasio showed that's not true, that rationality and emotion are actually intimately intertwined with each other, and rational decision-making becomes impossible unless you have emotions, right? And so he had a patient who had a brain injury that meant he couldn't access his emotions, and he was sort of like, Dr. Spock out of Star Trek. And this guy literally couldn't decide what time he wanted his next appointment to be, because he would sit here and start calculating through the pros and cons of every day and hour and date, and he couldn't make up his mind, right? And it turns out that having access to our feelings, that knowing that we care more about some things than others, that some things make us feel good and some make us feel bad, is part of how we make rational decisions. Like, how do we have a utility function in which we attach value to things? Well, it's partly how we feel about them, right? So emotions are necessary even to have rationality. But in addition, the old view of emotions is also still true, which is when we're in the grip of particularly strong, particularly powerful emotions, those can just override everything else in the brain, override any attempt at reasoned judgment, and kind of push us towards impulsive snap decisions that are, maybe very contrary, to our self-interest, right? So most of the research, as Nick framed it in his talk, points to the negative effects of that, right? How might emotions drive us towards escalation? But it's not necessarily the case that has to be the only impact of emotions, and maybe the right kinds of emotions in the right circumstances, can also bring us towards efforts at bringing about de-escalation. So I'm persuaded by all of this. I agree with it. I think it's an important insight. Here at MIS, we're a policy school. So we train our students to not just be interested in the theory and is this a good theory, but what do we do with it, right? Does it have any practical implications? So Nick, it sounds like you and Marcus are already working on this in your book, but the kind of obvious question that all of this raises is sort of both dynamics are possible, right? Crises could end in escalation, crises could end in de-escalation. What are the circumstances under which things go one way or another? What are the circumstances under which emotions induce de-escalation versus escalation. And I can think of a few types of variables that we might think about here. So one that you mentioned on your last slide is sort of individual traits of the leaders. Do they have certain personality types? Have they been through certain life experiences? Kennedy and Khrushchev had both lived through World War II. They knew what war was, right? Have they gone through certain socialization processes? So that would be one basket of things we could look at. Those are mostly not manipulable, other than like encouraging people to try to vote leaders with good personalities into office. You can think about the situational circumstances. What's the situation in which the crisis is occurring? With Cuba, it helped that it was not the home territory of either country that was really being held. That was the location of the crisis, and it was a third location. But again, like that may not be something that's manipulable in the short term. The geography and the technology and so forth, they're going to be what they are. So, the other thing I can think of, and Nick kindly mentioned some of my old work on nuclear learning here, is to go back to that, which is what information, what knowledge do decision makers already have in their heads when they come to the table in a crisis? How well do they understand what it means to use nuclear weapons? How well do they understand that mutual vulnerability is real, and that if they introduce nuclear use, they'll probably be retaliation and their own country will be hit? To what sense do they feel a sense of responsibility to their populations, to humanity, to the future, beyond the immediate crisis? So there's a whole set of things that we want to be in people's heads and in people's hearts when they're the leaders in a crisis, that you can't inculcate in them at the moment of decision. It has to already be there before the crisis begins. That, I think, might be manipulable in the sense that we could think about what are activities that we, as a scholarly community, as NGOs, as government officials or former government officials, as diplomats, what can we do to try to make sure that all the leaders around the world who could find themselves in charge of a nuclear arsenal one day come to the table with certain understandings about nuclear dangers, human fallibility, and how we can all make dumb decisions, shared responsibilities for the future of the human race, and so forth. And so I think to me this leads to an action agenda that I already want to promote through my own work. So I think this is another line that points there. But how do we encourage our leaders and the advisors around them and the people they think they're answerable to have a sense of nuclear dangers and a sense of the importance of prioritizing staying away from the brink and de-escalating, those crises that happen? And I think there might be some action items there that are doable in a policy sense that could help this work lead to some practical, valuable payoffs. So I'll stop there because I don't want to monopolize everybody's time, and I'll turn it back to you to moderate Q&A.
Thank you so much for these remarks. I think you also have put a lot on the table, which can again be delved into in great details. Thank you so much for this. So we will begin our Q&A. A couple of housekeeping rules. Raise your hands like Grace has done. Introduce yourself. Keep your questions succinct, and that's about it. I would prefer to have a couple of rounds of questions so that it becomes easier for Nick to answer those, and I'll hold my thoughts for the end. Over to you, Dr. Joshi, and then after that, Grace. You.
No, I think Grace had a hand raised first, so please go ahead, Grace.
Oh, Dr. Joshi, please,
No,
let's
no,
get
no, after you,
enough for
after you.
Okay, well, Dr. Wheeler, it's just been a pleasure. I told you before the conference started that I've been reading your work and am just really, really excited to be able to hear you in person and discuss these things with you. It's very meaningful to me. I'm excited by how tightly your work fits in with what we're doing at MISS. I'm in the NPTS degree, and I just last semester took a class with Dr. Anna Vasilyeva on strategic empathy, the concept that comes from Zachary Shore. And I think that that concept is a bit more broad and yours just kind of has it dialed in a little bit more, but it seems like the same thing. It's not necessarily about like a touchy-feely kind of emotional relationship between state leaders, but it's more about recognizing that we're humans and we work like humans even when we're leaders. And so it's been my personal hypothesis since my undergrad in international relations that IR could really benefit from some of the interpersonal wisdom and training that people can get these days in counseling in terms of like taking responsibility for mistakes in reconciliation and then even going forward, optimistically in the spirit of cooperation, but even with an adversary, just learning how not to exacerbate things that really don't need to be escalated, but they just kind of spiral out of control unintentionally as people, like, for example, call each other evil. And I know from personal experience that with like work and study and energy, we can get better at relating when it's tough and when emotions are high. And my grounding for the thought that you can apply that wisdom to international relations comes from two strands. The first one is that almost all state decisions are made by people, and usually a very few number of people, or even just one person. And that makes that one person's emotional state and the state of their relationships very meaningful. And the second thought is that I think there's a kind of collective psychology that applies to countries. It's a little bit bigger than the idea of group psychology, but like, for example, I think the whole entire Russian population has PTSD and that it gets worse with every generation. And I have Russian heritage, so hopefully I have the right to say something like that out loud. But I'm really interested to hear your response if you're able to muster something to my scrambled thinking here. And once again, I just really appreciate being able to be here in person with you. It's a pleasure.
Grace, thank you. You should write a paper on some of these aspects. Thank you so much. Over to you, Dr. Joshi.
Just want to check. I mean, you're the chair, Ali, but in case Nick wanted to respond, I don't know what those rules are.
That's fine. I think
we're collecting.
yeah,
So
we are collecting
okay.
questions.
Okay,
Yeah.
let me not waste time then.
Yeah.
So just a couple of thoughts slash questions. One was that specifically with respect to the Balakot crisis, which I think deserves a lot more research. So Nick, you mentioned there was no communication between the leaders, or that specifically on the side of India, Modi did not really respond. Maybe it was call screening or something. But I mean, there was, I think, some communication through intermediaries, perhaps, especially the United States. But in terms of what Jeff said about, the leaders themselves, their own characteristics, their own personalities, I think, one way of thinking about it might be, the importance of ideology for the leaders themselves, the need to project strength. Sorry if you've already covered this in your work, but the need to project strength, especially to domestic audiences. So to me, I think the domestic factors, they seem particularly compelling. I mean, they don't explain everything. But for example, if you look at earlier crises involving, another BJP Prime Minister, Atal Bihari Vajpayee, there you see very different kinds of responses. And here, I think the personal sort of characteristics of the leaders themselves might play a role. Vajpayee much more respected and a moderate leader relatively. Modi not so much. So I think the immense difference between their personalities, I think, played a role in how they reacted during crises, including issues related to communication. And the other point, specifically with the Balakot crisis, is just I think some of the ways in which different crises unfold. I wonder how you bring that into the analysis of that you've put forward. That I remember thinking, when the crisis was escalating, and before India had carried out the airstrike, I was convinced that the response from the Indian side would be a cruise missile strike. But then they actually sent fighter aircraft, and as we know, one of the Indian pilots was brought down, and and I think that might have actually helped to de-escalate the crisis in a weird sense. But here, I think counterfactually, if it had been a cruise missile strike, then what might we have seen? So yeah, those are a couple of quick thoughts that that I had. I'm sure I have some more that I'm forgetting, but thank you, Nick, and Jeff. Thanks for your comments. Also, I made some notes.
Thank you so much, Dr. Joshi. You hit the nail on the head with all your comments. Domestic factors and domestic commitment traps were also very important. And this was one of the points that I had to make. But thank you for covering this already. So over to you, Nick. Please, your responses to these two comments and questions.
So, first of all, thanks, Jeff, for, I think, a really interesting kind of set of reflections. Yeah, I mean, I think you put it really nicely when you said sort of, we can identify these different variables for why crises, don't escalate, the taboo. And I think that's exactly right. We want to put interpersonal interaction there as one of the, I think, at one point I thought about calling this work the fourth image, and kind of trying to, bring another image to the table, but that sounded a bit perhaps pretentious. But the idea that a lot of people have interpreted my work as being highly individualist. They talk about me having an individual conception of trust. But what we've tried to do, Marcus and I think, in our work, both individually and together, is really kind of emphasize that it's not an individualist approach, it's an interpersonal approach. And I think it's that and obviously, the interpersonal and the individual are yoked together, as you say, and as Shard was saying, and also Grace, I think, but it's we really want to emphasize the interpersonal, and hence the title of the book and so on. I mean, I think in terms of an action agenda, the most important thing is to educate decision makers and diplomats into recognizing the importance of security dilemma sensibility and recognizing the Butterfield situation. I mean, there are so many decision makers who are really good at seeing it in other conflicts, but never in their own. And that's a real problem. Jervis highlighted that all those years ago in Perception and Misperception, that, leaders are often good at seeing it in other people, but not in their own, but they need to be able to see it in their own. Now, of course, SDS is not a panacea, and it can be dangerously misplaced, as Chamberlain discovered when he went to Munich in, September 1938. So we have to be careful with that. But I think that is a segue then into what Grace, couple of quick points. I mean, first of all, I think Shaw's notion of strategic empathy is a really important one, but the problem with that kind of conception of empathy, a very cognitive one, is that you can use empathy to destroy your adversaries. So, if you go back to Sun Tzu, you put yourself in the shoes of the enemy in order to be able to destroy. So, I've always wanted to give security dilemma sensibility a more normative component, although, I don't think you have to, but I would want to, in the sense that you're fundamentally looking for the possibility that the conflict is driven by what Jervis would call a spiral model. That essentially, we're failing to communicate to one another the intentions that we have. We have peaceful intentions. We're in an assurance game situation, but we're just not able to communicate that. So the question then is, how do you go about testing out security dilemma sensibility and exploring its possibilities? And if both parties can come to have that shared narrative of a conflict, what does that then open up? And the work that I think where it's really interesting with you talking about counseling is that links really closely, I think, to the dialogical kind of method and approach that we've developed at BASIC, building on Herb Kelman's work, John Burton, and other, conflict resolution theorists over the decades, where essentially we're trying to kind of create a safe and secure space. So I think that's a really interesting resonance with counseling, to where people are in adversarial situations, but where they can feel that they can talk about, where their states are in adversarial situations, but where they're looking for ways to see if you can open up new possibilities of interaction. So I think that's a really interesting point. And then, you know, your comment about Russia is really interesting. I mean, I think how people who go through traumatic experiences then deal with that trauma when they find themselves in positions of high level responsibility is a really interesting question. And you know, trauma could lead you to potentially, I guess, to more confrontational policies. It could lead you though to look for reconciliation and so on. And I think a lot of that comes back, you know, Jeff has this really interesting discussion in his chapter around the relationship between fear and hope. And I had a PhD student recently, she wrote a PhD on the South Korean Moon Dae-ji's outreach on the Sunshine Policy. And her argument is that Moon Dae-ji's approach to the DPRK and to Kim Jong-il was influenced by the idea of hope, and that the response to the uncertainty and the security dilemma was to try to pursue this idea of kind of hope. And so, but I think what you're really exploring nicely, Jeff, is this idea that we need this kind of this appropriate level of fear, this healthy fear, but also don't lose the hope. And I mean, I just read the bit everybody reads out of the passage, but I noticed reading your chapter today, you've got that final bit where Khrushchev says, you know, we can find another way forward. And I think that's really interesting, you know, that, and both of them were looking for that. You know, if you look at Kennedy's June '63 speech, you know, at the American University afterwards, you know, it's a very different Kennedy. And then coming to Sharad, I mean, and I think this makes a link, you know, I think it was Roger Hilsman said, you know, about the Kennedy administration's response to the Soviet Union putting the missiles in Cuba. The United States wasn't in danger, but the Kennedy administration most certainly was. And you know, the domestic pressure on Kennedy after the Bay of Pigs to stand up to Khrushchev, you know, was enormous. But at the same time, you know, I think, you know, Martin Sherwin's wonderful book, magisterial book in my view, you know, rehabilitates to some degree, I think, Adlai Stevenson's role. And I think he played a really important role in persuading Kennedy that you've got to do this through diplomacy and only force at the very, very last kind of resort. So, yeah, you know, there was this domestic pressure to go in. And then I think the point you make about Vajpayee is really interesting because, of course, as you know, I've done a lot of work on that. And Vajpayee, of course, is the Indian leader who goes to Lahore and who, you know, develops the most comprehensive, groundbreaking set of nuclear CSBMs to this day in the relationship. And you know, I think the thing about Modi is there's a, you know, Vajpayee was a leader of the BJP, but he didn't have a Greater India ideological fundamentalist project in the way, you know, Greater Barand and all that. He didn't have that in the way that Modi does. And I think that's a big difference. But undoubtedly, you know, with the elections looming, that was a major factor for Modi in terms of the muscular response at Balakot. And for Kennedy, you know, couldn't afford not to stand up to Khrushchev. So, you know, you know, as much as I think Kennedy and Khrushchev deserve enormous amount of credit, of course, enormous amount. And we were so lucky to have those two at that moment in history. Nevertheless, Kennedy did make the decision to start down a road of escalation that ultimately, you know, coming back to Jeff's point about luck, you know, there's a lot of luck in that story as well. I mean, Sherwin brings that out. Benoit brings that out really well in his work. Len Scott, my old colleague at Aberystwyth, who's got a great book on the Cuban Missile Crisis, if you want one book to go to, came out last year. You know, Len's got an interesting discussion of luck as well. And I think, you know, LeBeau's work as well. So a lot of, you know, people have recognized the importance of luck. There's a great quote from McNamara somewhere where he says, you know, you know, we needed the great statecraft, but we also needed we also needed luck. And you made the point about, we lucked out the Atchison line about the crisis. And then that raises the question, how many crises can you have before your luck runs out? You can ride your luck for so long, but how many can you go? And as you say, Jeff, we're 80 years in August, but what about when we're 160 years in? At what point, I think it's that great line from Martin Amis in Einstein's Monsters, where he says the problem with nuclear deterrence is that it can't last out the necessary lifespan between now and the death of the sun. And when you think of it in those terms, the challenge of getting beyond the nuclear paradigm, of escaping nuclearism is one that we have to keep working at and finding a way through. Yeah. Okay.
So much. Thank you so much. This is turning out to be a fascinating discourse, and we have so much to dabble in. And I'm loving as a reader, I'm loving the references that both of you are bringing to the discussion. And obviously, one can never read enough. I contest this term well read, because I think nobody can be well read, because there's so much to read, but one can only try. Um, so we have two more hands raised. So uh, I'll ask Max to introduce himself and ask a question first. Max, over to you.
Thanks, Ali. Right, I'm Max Patterson in the MPTS program. You've really anticipated my question. I was going to ask about how to handle domestic political pressure for a hardline stance. So I suppose I can modify that to, how do you present those overtures and that trust building, that interpersonality with an adversary to a domestic audience so that they can understand it?
Yeah, thank you. We have Gretchen. Can you please?
Yes, I'm Gretchen Hund, and I'm on the advisory council for CNS, and spent my career at Pacific Northwest National Lab and was the director for the Center for Global Security. And I've been retired now for 4 or 5 years, and currently the chair of the Plowshares Fund board. So that's kind of who I am. And we have been working with NTI on developing a new kind of nuclear narrative to try and help people see that nuclear weapons really don't make you safer, and trying to look at kind of interesting ways to kind of help people see actually how they can be destabilizing. And that's going to be coming out very shortly. We just have the draft out at this point. But my question to both probably Jeff and Nick is to think about, what can we do to try, and I'm thinking about the current state right now. We've talked about the past Cuban Missile Crisis, but I can't help, given the role I have as chair of this board, to think about where we are right now. And I don't know about you gentlemen and women, but it's pretty terrifying. And so thinking about, how do we take the work you're doing and think about how to influence our current leadership, and also because of this nuclear narrative work we're doing, thinking about those people who can influence those leaders, and how can this work be done to have that kind of intermediary step so that we can maybe bring the temperature down a bit. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much. I have one that I look forward to reading this report, which is obviously very timely too. You have completed the circle. We are a policy school, and it's ideal that you asked a question about the policy relevance and the implications of the work that both Nick and Dr. Knopf are doing. So, Nick, could you respond to these two questions and comments?
Yeah, no, great questions. Yeah, Gretchen, hi, good to meet you. That sounds really interesting, the report. Yeah, I'm struggling a bit, as I guess we all are, to try and make sense of kind of what's going on here. I mean, on the one hand, it would look to me like there is a fundamental transformation of the transatlantic relationship underway. I mean, we've had burden sharing, you know, some of us on the call are a bit older than others. We've had burden sharing debates forever and a day. But they've all been within a broad context of a commitment to Atlantic security, and that European security and American security were indivisible. And that seems to be fundamentally breaking down. And at the same time, the United States nuclear orthodoxy that seems to be driving nuclear modernization in the States seems to be dominated by this idea that there are multiple nuclear adversaries. So, and the United States has to have parity with all of them combined, which makes arms control, when you think about it, incredibly difficult with any individual one of them. In fact, impossible. But also, and this is less explicit, but in administration circles, in terms of what was being said under the Biden administration, but I think it is there. If you look at something like Vipin Narang's speech at CSIS last year, which is that these nuclear adversaries are of a different order of magnitude in terms of their willingness to manipulate nuclear risk. So that the United States confronts multiple nuclear challengers who are much more risk acceptant of much more risk acceptant in the sense that they're willing to manipulate nuclear threats for intimidatory purposes. So that starts to set up an extremely difficult situation, because the implications of that are that there will be an unending armaments competition, and that the strategic chain will get itself in overdrive as India responds to China, and China finds itself responding to America, and America responds to China, and so on. So all of those dynamics that I've talked about that drive security competition, these peaceful defensive self-images, this inability to recognize how your own weapons can be seen as threatening, and so on. These look like they're going to be really prominent. But then at the same, so then that made me, so I had this kind of thing going on in my head, and I keep asking people around me and on calls occasionally, is it more dangerous than when I was an undergraduate student in the early 1980s? You know, and I think it's a really difficult question, because at the same time, it would appear to me, and maybe this is not going to happen, but the other great tectonic plate that seems to be shifting here is that there seems to be a fundamental realignment between the United States and Russia underway here in this administration. And so actually the risks of nuclear crisis may actually be less, because the United States appears to be, under this administration, willing to play Putin's game of what constitutes great power and responsibility, which is essentially that they carve up the former Soviet Union back under their control again. That's me putting it crudely, but that would be my reading of it. Now, the Biden administration and the British and the Europeans fundamentally opposed that conception of how great powers should interact together and manage their relations. Although during the Cold War, spheres of influence were considered by people like Hedley Bull and the English School of International Relations and International Society kind of approach as one of the mechanisms for reducing the risks of conflict between the great powers. So if it is the case that Putin, Xi, and Trump are all going to kind of make some kind of common ground about what the world should be governed by in terms of great power relations at the expense of smaller states, and indeed any kind of notion of human rights, then actually the risks of great power collision between them, at least in the short to medium term, might be a lot less than it would be if there was there was to be a fundamental kind of if the conflict between authoritarian and liberalism was to manifest itself in a nuclear crisis. Because my worry at the moment is that American liberalism seems to be massively in danger. And the implications of that, I think, we're just beginning. I mean, just to very quickly finish that, I think the risks, though, of a nuclear crisis between the Europeans and the Russians are probably much higher. Because now the Europeans are being abandoned, in Glenn Snyder's classic language. And the debate that's going on in my government and in this wider kind of intellectual circles and in Europe, of course, is what on earth are the Europeans going to do if they find themselves in a nuclear crisis with Russia and there's no United States backstop? And this is going to get very difficult if the Europeans decide to put some kind of force to protect a Ukrainian ceasefire deal, whatever. So I think, Gretchen, I'm pretty confused about where all those currents go. But what I'm pretty clear about is that, and Phil I see has joined the call. Great to see you, Phil. Phil and I have been having this conversation about whether there's enough tacit understandings to kind of keep us out of trouble. And Phil has this line from Fritz Ermuth that he shared with me, where Fritz Ermuth was saying that in the end, although Abel Archer might have been a worrying moment, both sides had each other's cookbooks. And I think what I was worried about was that maybe, with the Biden administration and Putin, there was a real concern that the guardrails were falling away. Now, the guardrails may not be needed if you get this almost unthinkable realignment in which Russia and America actually have some kind of condominium at the expense of the Asian alliance systems and the European alliance systems. But the consequences of that for proliferation could potentially be catastrophic, I think. And the idea that there won't be, so that comes back, Gretchen, then to the challenge of how do you marginalize nuclear weapons and push them into the background of international relations when the urgency to have them in a deteriorating security environment for the allies could potentially be higher than it's ever been. Sorry, that was all a bit jumbled, but hopefully there was something there.
And thank you so much, Nick. If you could just briefly respond.
Sorry. Yeah, so Phil Williams taught me as a master's student at Southampton University a long, long time ago. And so this is a line that he gave me, which which I've used many, many times over the years, which is that Richard Nixon was the first president to go to China in 1972 because he didn't have to worry about Richard Nixon. And Ronald Reagan, this is my line now, was the first president to go to Moscow in 1988 because he didn't have to worry about Ronald Reagan. So the answer, Max, I would say, is that the leaders that have strong domestic policy legitimacy are in a position to make these overtures in a way that weaker leaders are not. So Atal Bihari Vajpayee could go to Lahore, could make peace with the Pakistani leadership, could offer the concessions that he did because he was such a strong leader in Indian politics and he had that policy legitimacy. And that's why democratic presidents historically have struggled with these kind of outreaches, because they've always had the vulnerability that they're going to be accused of being soft on the Soviet Union and so on. So it comes back to this question that you've got to have a leader that's got secure policy legitimacy. If you look at Christopher Clary's wonderful book on India-Pakistan relations, what Chris shows is that the leadership cycles have never been in sync at the right time. And I think that's a real challenge.
Thank you so much, Nick. And I'm glad you mentioned Christopher Clary's leadership primacy theory. I had the pleasure of hosting him for a podcast on that book. And yes, the alignment has to be perfect. But unfortunately, in the Indo-Pak situation, that alignment has never been perfect. Do we have any other?
Yeah, Phil, go ahead for a moment. Yeah.
Okay, Nick, to go back to the point you were just making about Europe, I mean, we really gonna have to deal with the thorny question of Germany and nuclear weapons. And the only thing that makes sense is Britain and France working with the Germans on a tripartite nuclear posture that has the support of the rest of Europe.
Yeah, I mean, I think extended deterrence is going to be. This is going to be a real challenge, and then somehow, I mean, the Chancellor-elect has already made a statement that significantly suggests that there's a recognition that there's got to be an independent European defense capability, and you don't really have to do very much to draw the dots there. Yeah, and I think that's right, and I think Starmer's decision yesterday to up the budget, they're planning to go to 3%, towards the end of the parliament. And there's no doubt about it. A lot of that spending, some of that spending will be on conventional forces, building up the army and trying to have a bit more capability. But a lot of it, I'm sure, will go into developing air-launched standoff cruise missiles. I'm sure there's going to be an air leg now to some kind of Anglo-French and project that will have to involve the Germans. Yeah. And I don't know how much you caught of it, Phil, but I mean, you've studied these debates for decades. I mean, it's a seismic moment, right, with the Trump people when they're making those kind of statements about European security. I mean, this isn't Mike Mansfield in the Senate. Phil wrote a great book about this, pulling troops out to try and improve, European contribution to NATO. This is something fundamental, which may not endure beyond this administration. We can hope for that. But in the meantime, what are the consequences of this?
That's right. And Vance should have been tarred and feathered and run out of town for that speech at Munich. It was disgraceful. And we're just going to get more and more of that kind of stuff.
We can have a series of programs on that speech alone. That was so. I mean, one has a lot to say about that speech, but I agree with the overall notion that you're trying to bring to the table. We have another question. Please introduce yourself and ask the question.
Are you talking to me, Ali?
Yes, I am.
Thank you. Very nice. Thank you. Congratulations for this event. Really, it is very important at this moment. I am Elaine White. I am professor of practice and diplomat from Costa Rica, and also part of the advisory board of CNS. I think as Gretchen, I heard her question, and I just could not, agree more. Sometimes, and excuse me for the language I'm going to use, but sometimes in the last days, I feel a little bit like a dinosaur looking at the current world. And trying to make sense of everything that I see. So my question now, because you also try to see where the good news might be. My first question is whether there could be an expectation that the but with this rapprochement between the US and Russia, would give us any expectation that nuclear policy and nuclear posturing is going to be under revision to those dreaming and working for disarmament. If this could be, a moment for change.
Thank you, and thank you for your meritorious contributions to bringing about nuclear peace at a time when diplomacy has already been is on the back burner. Thank you so much. Over to you, Nick. Just briefly respond to this.
Yeah, it's a pleasure to meet you, and likewise. And that's a great question. I mean, Trump has said, that he wants the US and Russia to reduce arsenals. I mean, it's an intriguing thought. I can't quite get my head around it, but if there is to be this realignment where basically the United States and Russia have more in common with each other than in terms of security thinking than the United States has with its closest allies in Europe and Asia. Then it's
Just listening
not,
to that is a very difficult thing to listen to, right?
yeah. Well, it's stunning because I was trying to think about a historical parallel for it the other day. I mean, it is really stunning. I mean, and it shows, you know, I mean, as someone who's just finished a book on the importance of interpersonal dynamics, I mean, it does show what can happen. I mean, you know, in October 1986, Reagan and Gorbachev got in the room together and came very close, you know, to abolishing US-Soviet nuclear weapons. So you can't rule out the possibility that there could be, you can't rule out anything. That's the problem with these things at the moment. There is the possibility that there could be a major disarmament agreement. Of course, then you've got to think about, where does China fit into that? And I mean, at the moment, you know, one of my colleagues, Stefan Wolf, who writes a lot for The Conversation, he wrote a piece the other day, and he described it as a dysfunctional love triangle between Xi, Putin, and Trump. But you know, love triangles can rapidly change, and people can very quickly go from being lovers to other things. So where China would fit into this remains a very interesting question, because historically, of course, the problem with any kind of tripolar arms control has been that China would have to have parity with the United States and Russia before I think it would enter. If you think back to the history of SALT, the Soviets only sat down to start seriously talking about strategic nuclear arms control when they got parity. And I don't think the Chinese will enter into any kind of serious negotiations with the Americans and the Russians until they have parity. But the position in Washington hitherto has been that under no circumstances will they allow China to have any kind of parity with the United States. And of course, the other way of reading this would be the Mearsheimer argument, that in the end, what Trump is doing, and I do wonder where Michael Waltz fits into this, that what Trump is doing is he's trying to prize apart Russia and China. Now, if you read it in that way, rather than a fundamental realignment, then it starts to look more like the 1970s. And the reason why Nixon went to China, of course, was to change the balance with the Soviets and to open up the possibility of then having better relations with the two poles than they had with each other. So then you could start to see, you know, this would be the argument that ultimately the United States is trying to buy the Russians out of their relationship with China so that the US can then compete with the fundamental competitor that it sees it in all of the technology spheres and nuclear and so on. But yeah, so I think quite where China would fit into that, and at what point Xi wants to be part of the Trump-Putin party, I think these are going to be fascinating questions. But what I think it shows me is that actually it probably is a more dangerous world than the early 1980s, because we don't have predictabilities in the way that even then we did. So I'm backing up a bit, Phil, on some of my earlier comments with you. Partly, I think, because maybe the world of today is so bewildering and frightening. And if we do get runaway proliferation, then, you know, the implications of that in the 80th anniversary year are, I think, really frightening to contemplate, because clearly the more of these dreadful monsters that are on the board, to use Martin Amos's term, you know, the more risk there is of us using these things. So yeah, I think it's a great question. Thank you. Great questions overall.
Yeah, while there is less hope, I do believe being hopeless is not an option. Grace, if you have a very small comment to make, please do so, because we want to wrap up this program in the interest of time.
Okay, I recognize we're running out of time, and I also saw Dr. Williams wanted to say something, but I know that Raymond Garthoff, one of the SALT I negotiators, was pointing out that although we didn't achieve SALT until the Russians had parity, with the United States, one of the things that they noticed about the United States was that the US proposed SALT officially back when that would have meant that they were perhaps trying to enshrine their nuclear superiority. And then they went forward with SALT on and on and on as the Soviets caught up and caught up. And finally, the Soviets were able to realize, like, the US just wants this arms control talk. It doesn't actually have anything to do with our parity with them from their perspective. And I'm just wondering if you think that might still be the case, and if that's something that somebody could put forward that might matter to the other countries. I don't know.
Just a quick response would suffice, Nick.
I think the fundamental problem in the 1970s was that in the end, the United States didn't want to accept the Soviet Union as a legitimate political and military equal. And there were moments when the administrations did, but in the end, the fundamental drift was not to accept that. And I think the problem with China is that the US has got the same challenge of whether it's willing to accept parity with China. And of course, if you talk to people on the strategic right of the United States, they'll tell you that in the end, the Chinese don't want parity, they want superiority. And that they have a fundamentally different conception of these things. And so the US has to behave in this way, coming back to my multiple nuclear adversary point and the risk-taking brinkmanship, because otherwise it won't be secure. And, you know, this echoes for me the debates that we were having in the late 1970s. You know, we don't want a theory of nuclear victory over the Soviet Union, but they've got one over us, so we better have one over them. And, you know, that dynamic becomes extremely dangerous. So I think it comes back to your, you know, your earlier point about, you know, the need to find an empathy that is connecting of our humanity. And I think, you know, you look at some of those early negotiations in the SALT deal, it was very, you know, there was that kind of recognition of the importance of vulnerability and so on. But it wasn't sufficiently rooted in, coming back to the point, Max's point and Sherrod's point about the domestic, it never got enough policy legitimacy on both sides to be sustained. I think that was a big part of the problem. But Dr. Williams wrote a great book on détente and its collapse, which is relatively short, highly accessible, and a brilliant contribution. So I would suggest that's well worth looking at.
And with that, Dr. Williams, please share some thoughts if you have at the end, and then we'll wrap up.
Phil, you're muted.
So one, you know, I think there's a danger of giving Trump too much credit. Trump is under Putin's influence for whatever reason, and I think we need to be clear about that. And I think it's to do with money. I think it's to do with being bailed out in the past, and I really think that's an important factor. And it fits. I mean, all roads lead back to Russia, and the brutal way in which they are basically dismantling NATO, I think, reinforces that. Having said that, I think there could be a result that you in a sense get close to Russia and then you can focus more on China. But again, I think that's a very dangerous assumption that Russia's not going to stab you in the back when they want to. So I think that's still a possibility. But I think you're right. I've really enjoyed this. I'm sorry I couldn't join for the whole thing, but it's been a pleasure to work with Nick recently on some of this and with Ken Booth. So and it's great to see old friends like Jeff and Sharon again. So thank you for the opportunity.
Thank you so much, Dr. Williams, and thank you also for your brilliant contributions to the field. So it has been a fascinating discussion. I have a habit of speaking for long, but you know, time is of the essence, and in its interest, I would have to wrap up this conversation. I'll obviously take this conversation bilaterally with Nick, and we have been discussing these things for a long time, and we will discuss these things going forward as well. But I just want to pick up one point that Dr. Jeff raised about leaders' knowledge. Uh, Apropos of the Pulwama Balakot crisis, I think there is a need to understand there's a need to understand two important phenomena. One is the knowledge of one is the understanding of history or of the arc of history of the two leaders, and two is the relevance that both leaders had about the use of force as an instrument of state policy. Once you understand those two differences between the two leaders back during that time, we can make sense of how the two acted in Feb 2019. But as they say, it's a game of fine margins, and when it comes to nuclear weapons, those fine margins can be colossal or can lead to colossal damage. So when Pakistan had to respond to India's infringement of sovereignty, it had the option of striking an Indian military compound, which at that time was housing the Indian local military command, and the army chief was on a visit to that place, or an open space near that compound. Imagine if the Pakistani leadership had decided to hit that Indian military compound instead of that empty space. Things could have been different. And as Nick rightly pointed out, you know, threatening a nuclear armed country with 6 missile strikes on 6 different targets across that country, it was a very, very dangerous step. And obviously, Pakistan then threatened to do 3 times over. And right now, unfortunately, we do not have any mechanisms to ascertain as to whether an incoming missile is armed with a nuclear warhead or a conventional warhead. So I understand leadership dynamics are important. I understand there is scope and room for uh, increasing and strengthening relational elements, but this uncertainty, um, aggravated by the advent of EDTs or emerging and disruptive technologies, is certainly a very disruptive phenomenon that we just cannot ignore. So I once again thank you, Nick. I thank all the participants, especially Dr. Knopf, for his excellent remarks. I'm very happy with the quality of questions that were put on the table. I really look forward to having this panel once again. Unfortunately, we are in a situation where we will have to talk about these issues many a time in not too distant a future. I hope that is not the case going forward, but we live in uncertain times. So thank you so much. Until next time. Bye.
Thank you.
Thanks, everybody.
was a
That's really
pleasure.
great set of questions. Thank you for being here, and I really enjoyed talking to you all, and hopefully I can do it again at some point in the future. Great to see you, Jeff, Phil, and lovely to meet the rest of you. Thanks, Ali, as ever.
Thank you very much.
Thank you. Thanks, Ali. It was great to meet you, Dr. Wheeler. I appreciate it.
Yeah, great to meet you, Grace. Yeah,
Thank
reach out if you want to kind of follow up with anything, or and good luck with your work.
Thank you very much.